Cannabis. From the dawn of its discovery, humans have utilized the drug for recreational and medical purposes. But how has cannabis prevailed under the test of time, and how has its usage changed and been prohibited over the decades? But first, what is cannabis? Cannabis, often referred to as weed or marijuana, comes from the cannabis plant. It contains THC, which affects brain function. The flowers and leaves of cannabis are often dried, then smoked or eaten for the psychoactive effects of THC, which can alter perception and mood. According to the University of Sydney, early use of cannabis can be traced as far back as 2800 BC. Cannabis was used to treat a vast array of health problems and was listed in Emperor Shen Nung's Pharmacopoeia. Despite first usage of cannabis being in Central Asia, ancient texts from the Indian Hindus, Assyrians, Greeks, and Romans all indicate to the usage of cannabis in early society. With a drug that is so influential in many of our societies, it is essential that we analyze how its usage has changed and developed over the ages. Firstly, let's pose the question, how has the usage of cannabis for therapeutic purposes changed over time? Ancient Hindu sacred texts, such as the Atharva Veda, named cannabis as one of the 5 most sacred plants on earth. In such text, cannabis is not just a sacred plant, but a source of happiness and a liberator. Later on, approximately 129 to 200 AD Greek physician Galen popularized the use of cannabis for its therapeutic properties and mood enhancements. Many other ancient texts, such as those from the Assyrians, indicate to cannabis being used for healing, typically to relieve or alleviate the symptoms of other medical conditions. The Western world was introduced to the medicinal and therapeutic benefits of cannabis in 1841 by William Brooke O'Shaughnessy. William wrote the Introduction of Cannabis in 1839, an extensive and detailed paper on the therapeutic benefits of cannabis after his time spent helping patients in India. In his paper, he cited concise case studies of patients suffering from rheumatism, hydrophobia, cholera, and tetanus, as well as a 40-day-old baby with convulsions, who responded well to cannabis therapy, leaping from near death to, quote, the enjoyment of robust health in a few days. After demonstrating his founding to the Pharmaceutical Society, cannabis was transported to England for medicinal research and practice. The pivotal changes in cannabis usage for medicinal purposes began in the later half on the 1930s. This shift can be largely associated with 1936 film Reefer Madness, which demonized cannabis as a highly addictive drug that caused mental disorder and violent behavior.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity.
This film completely flipped the public opinion of cannabis and ironically caused a change in the societal perception of cannabis that resulted in cannabis being abused for recreational purposes rather than the original therapeutic purposes it was intended for. Although there was no tangible change in cannabis itself, the public eye began to antagonize the drug. This inevitably put cannabis under intensive scrutiny by medical professionals and, more importantly, politicians. This led to the medicinal purposes of cannabis being effectively negated by the Marijuana Tax Act. The therapeutic usage of cannabis became much less frequent after 1937, and many other nations, including England, adopted views on cannabis similar to the United States. Further research conducted in the U.S. in 1970 listed cannabis to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse under the Controlled Substance Act. Many of the previous notions in regard to the therapeutic benefits of cannabis were dismissed as mass media continued to antagonize the drug. Furthermore, the hippie movements cannabis was associated with in the late 1960s gave cannabis negative connotations amongst the public, specifically the conservative portion of the population. Later controlled studies on cannabis from 1988 to 2007 gave the scientific field a better understanding of cannabis and its medicinal properties. Later in 2012, CBD was shown to alleviate schizophrenia symptoms in patients comparable to a conventional antipsychotic drug. Now generally, cannabis has highly regulated and adapted medicinal and therapeutic purposes across the world, in contrast to its prolific, unregulated usage in the Southeast Asian countries centuries prior. But cannabis itself has generally remained in continuity over the years, with little to no natural or human alterations to the drug. But the perception and the usage of the drug has been volatile. Now, how has the legalization and distribution of cannabis demonstrated change and continuity over the years? Cannabis had a drastic impact on changing laws regarding drugs internationally. The changes in legislature against cannabis around the world were largely a result of the two international opium conventions of 1912 and 1925. These conventions highly influenced international law regarding the distribution and usage of cannabis. A long list of countries across the globe, such as Germany, the US, China, France, UK, Italy, Japan, Portugal, Russia, and many more, signed an international treaty that limited the distribution of cannabis whilst employing strict legislation that prohibited its usage. These conventions founded long-term anti-cannabis law framework that would stay for decades to come. The opium conventions did not employ a blanket ban on cannabis, but rather emphasized the need for regulation of the drug whilst also paving a path for the future of the legal aspect of cannabis. This drastic change inspired many nations to utilize stricter regimes and laws against cannabis. For example, in 1926, Australia banned the import and export of cannabis, but it required local legal bodies to begin legislating and implementing laws consistent with the International Opium Convention to officially make it illegal nationwide. Cannabis itself has been prohibited and illegal for recreational use in Australia for more than a century, despite various cannabis legalization efforts gaining traction over the decades. The 1960s saw a skyrocket in the usage of perception and mental-altering drugs, particularly cannabis. This movement was instigated by those opposed to the Vietnam War who wanted different lifestyles and experiences. Globally, the 2000s paved the way for a less strict legislation against cannabis. Studies conducted in the 2000s revealed various therapeutic benefits to cannabis that had previously been overruled by outdated research. New and profound discoveries such as cannabis, showing to alleviate schizophrenia symptoms, put cannabis back in the limelight. The 2010s decade was the mark of another drastic change in the legal status of cannabis. Many countries that previously overlooked cannabis as a medicinal drug began to take steps back, reintroduce cannabis as a pharmaceutical item. Some states began to legalize the production of cannabis. For example, the Narcotic Drugs Amendment Act of 2016 legalized the cultivation, production, and distribution of medicinal marijuana in Australia. As of now, 23 states of the U.S. have legalized the production of cannabis for recreational and medicinal purposes. Over the past 2 decades, more than 15 notable nations have made strong changes in legislation with the focus of decriminalizing and legalizing cannabis usage. During this period, a significant continuity in regards with cannabis was broken. For half a decade, cannabis distribution remained as a thriving black market industry. Cannabis across the globe was dealt and distributed via various nefarious means, including smuggling and trafficking. Major black market players and mafias took their share in the billion-dollar black market industry by forming large chains of domestic production and distribution. This is shown through the actions of the infamous Cornbread Mafia, who created the largest domestic marijuana production operation in the USA and amassed a fortune. This practice kept continuing all the way to the late 2000s with the invention of Silk Road, the largest dark web narcotics marketplace which sold many varieties of cannabis internationally. But with this ever-rising wave of legalized cannabis production, many black market producers were put out of business or shifted to operate in the light, significantly changing the black market cannabis industry and putting many suppliers out of business. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Two of my favorite things are sitting on my front porch, smoking a pipe of sweet hemp and playing my Hohner harmonica." Although the validity of this quote is questionable, it does prove a message. Every generation, nation, and government will continue to be affected by cannabis. How we as a society use and perceive cannabis in the future will only be told with time. Change is inevitable.